BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, the art of the deal.
The US and UK have been working for years to try and make a deal. And it never quite got there.
Yeah.
It did with this Prime Minister.
The UK-US trade deal and what it means for British farmers.
We said we had red lines on standards, particularly in agriculture. We've kept to those standards. The SPS red line is a red line that's written into the agreement. And so I think if you put that package together, you can see that it's a significant step in the right direction for our country and our national interest.
The UK Prime Minister and the US President on different sides of the Atlantic announcing a trade deal between the two countries. President Trump hailed it as an agreement which will dramatically increase access to UK markets for American farmers, involving, he said, billions of dollars and singling out ethanol, where the UK tariff on American imports will be removed, and beef, where a reciprocal agreement has been made. But the UK ban on American chlorine-washed chicken and hormone-treated beef continues. Since President Trump introduced his tariffs, most UK goods exported to the US faced a 10% tariff, with a 27.5% charge for cars and 25% for steel. Under the terms of this deal, that 10% tariff remains, for instance, on cheese, with the UK now able to send 100,000 cars into the US on a 10% tariff, and the US tariff on steel will be removed. Ali Renison is a former advisor on trade to the UK government and now a partner at the strategic advice firm SEC Newgate.
Well, the first thing to say is it's not a deal. It's sort of an outline framework with some sort of baseline commitments. I think that there has been some effort to sort of show that there are some reciprocal arrangements going on, whether you look at sort of what's been agreed that we know of in some of the agricultural space. I mean, I do think that the US is sort of committed to slashing some of its tariffs, not even back to where it was before Liberation Day, as it were, but actually on auto tariffs, we've seen it sort of go down from 25% to 10%, which is a lot higher than what we had before. So I think the main thing to say is that the negotiations are going to continue. This is the start of a sort of process.
On agriculture, the government in the UK is stressing that it is not accepting food produced to lower standards, so no chlorine chicken, no hormone beef. But this agreement does make it easier to import beef from the US, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, we see that there's an announcement of a reciprocal kind of quota arrangement for sort of an extra 13,000 sort of tons for kind of beef. You know, reading between the lines of what the government is saying is that ultimately we aren't going to change the rules about what we allow to be imported in terms of food safety and production standards on sort of farming sort of produce. But ultimately, we might be looking at basically creating a more generous kind of import allowance for beef that meets the UK standards.
The US Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins talked about this exponentially increasing our beef exports. The US currently makes up 0.05% of UK beef imports. Do you expect to see much change in that?
It depends on, how much of the, let's say, American agricultural sector when it comes to beef can actually sort of produce to UK standards. I think if you compare it with poultry, where actually a lot of poultry and chicken that's being sort of processed and sort of sent abroad is not actually chlorine rinsed the way that it used to be. If you look at some of the data, at least 80% of a lot of beef in America is still produced with hormones. So I think it's a growing potential market for farmers that are willing to sort of have a different approach to the way in which they rear their livestock. And
certainly from what the Agriculture Secretary suggested in the press conference, she is very keen that they look at other meats.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, when you look at sort of speaking to certainly Republican members of Congress that are in big rural agricultural states, on my last trip to Washington recently, they want to look at different types of sort of produce that don't have to deal with the same levels of sort of, let's say, ractopamine kind of hormone treated sort of issues, and potentially sort of create a more diversified market beyond just some of the sort of classical discussion about beef, which is usually what we see in sort of trade discussions between not just the US and the UK, but the US and the EU historically.
Overall, the 10% tariff that President Trump imposed on other goods going from the UK to the US remains. Has the UK given more than it's got here?
I think we can only make that assessment once the full sort of suite of agreements has actually been done. So as I said, this is sort of an outline agreement of some of the kind of initial ambitions for the agreement. But ultimately, as I think even President Trump conceded, I'm not sure it'll be a matter of weeks per se. It might be longer than that we're going to sort of hammer out the details over the next couple of weeks and months. Certainly, there are some tariffs, particularly in the auto sector, that the US has agreed to sort of slash immediately pending kind of this ongoing negotiation. But again, if you look at sort of what they've been slashed to, they're still higher than what we were before Trump came into office. So I think it remains to be seen what actually happens at the end of this negotiating process.
Ali Renison. The National Farmers Union has welcomed the government maintaining standards, not allowing imports of hormone-treated beef, for instance, but said that two agricultural sectors have been singled out to shoulder the heavy burden of the removal of tariffs for other industries in the economy. And it warned UK agriculture cannot continue to shoulder such imbalances in future negotiations. NFU President Tom Bradshaw.
We cannot be sacrificial when it comes to further negotiations that look to try and lower those tariffs. Agriculture can't give any more to protect the rest of the economy. And at the moment, bioethanol tariffs have been reduced. We don't know what that will mean for the future of our bioethanol manufacturing here in the UK, and therefore what that means for the demand of our crops that go into bioethanol. So there's still uncertainty around that, but we also have to recognise this isn't back to zero tariffs. There'll be further negotiation, and UK agriculture hasn't got any more to give within that negotiation.
NFU President Tom Bradshaw. Well, 13,000 tonnes of American beef can now come into the UK tariff-free, with the same amount of UK beef going to the US, also without a tariff. I asked Neil Shand, Chief Executive of the National Beef Association, if that's a good deal for UK farmers.
We've had worse deals. Let's put it that way. From the information we've got at the moment, 13,000 tonnes reciprocal, so in and out. But we don't know if that's per month, per year, or 5 years. There's no timeline on that yet. So it is hard to say how good a deal it is. My gut feeling is it could have been worse.
How competitive can UK farmers be on price in comparison with US ranchers?
Well, at the moment, our price has increased significantly since the start of the year, and American base costs are much lower. And perhaps one of the positives that might come out of this in the long term is that the Westminster government look at supporting more British-produced beef.
Although equally, consumers might just buy on price.
Predominantly, consumers do buy on price. And it remains to be seen when and if US beef arrives, how it's priced and which bit of our market it ends up in.
And I guess we have to keep this in proportion, because currently it's 0.05% of the UK's beef imports which come from the US. So even the exponential increase that the Americans are talking about might not actually be huge.
We have to be realistic. We do import beef. We're not self-sufficient. And as an organisation, it's equally important to us that the consumer is able to source beef.
As you say, this could have been worse. There was some expectation that beef which had been fed growth-promoting hormones might be allowed. Are you confident that is definitely not going to happen?
We've heard the Prime Minister and we've seen a copy of his written statement. So there should be no hormone-treated beef arrive into the UK. Of course, we'll watch that very closely, and the labelling and traceability will be monitored very, very closely.
There's also talk about trying to get a better agreement with the EU. How important is that in comparison with this?
It's our closest market. The 13,000 tonnes market that may be now open in the US is very small in comparison to what we already send to the EU. All the noises are that we are getting slightly closer to the EU on many fronts. We have to maintain our trade with the EU. That's vital to agriculture as a whole, but certainly to the beef industry. And I really don't want to compliment the government, but there's an argument that the trade deal from today is certainly better than the previous government did with Australia and New Zealand.
Neil Shand from the National Beef Association. Well, the government here in the UK says this deal will boost trade. The Secretary of State for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, Steve Reid, told me they've got a good deal for UK farmers.
Well, this is a really good outcome for the UK. The government's negotiated in the national interest, and we've got a really good deal that will benefit the entire economy. But it's also a good deal for farming and for agriculture. If you think what used to happen under the previous government, how the Conservative government signed dodgy trade deals that undercut British farmers on standards for the environment and welfare, We've done nothing of the sort. We said we'd maintain those standards in international trade deals. We have maintained them. There is no weakening of UK food or food production standards on imports as a result of this deal. Secondly, looking at beef, which is where the focus of this deal has been, the arrangements are fully reciprocal. So the US can sell 13 kilotons of US beef into the UK. That's about 1.5% of the UK beef market, so relatively small, but it's reciprocal. So UK beef producers can sell that same quantity of beef into the US. That is a fantastic opportunity. And it hasn't involved us agreeing to bring in any kind of hormone treated beef or chlorinated chicken, all of the horror stories that we saw previously, and the kind of things that, Nigel Farage has been telling us he would be happy to do if he was in government.
Although farmers point out that it's two agricultural sectors, as they see it, singled out to shoulder the burden of the removal of tariffs for other industries in the economy, like cars.
This is a good outcome for British agriculture. The fact that we've got almost exclusive access to the US beef market, the biggest market in the world, is really a huge opportunity indeed. And it's reciprocal, so the same quantity in either direction.
Yeah, and that is a worry, isn't it? Because the US beef is going to be a lot cheaper. There's going to be an impact there.
Well, it's only 1.5% of the total UK market. And my guess is it's going to be looking more at the premium end of the market. The deal works out better for British producers because they have access to a much bigger market in the United States. That is a real opportunity to sell a premium British product at a premium price. That is going to benefit British agriculture. And, we've never said we're going to be protectionist. The NFU has never said to me they want protectionism. They've said they want a level playing field on which British producers can compete and win in our own domestic market. That's what we've given them. We have not undercut on environmental or welfare standards.
The American Agriculture Secretary is really, really keen to get agreements now on poultry and pork. How likely is that?
Well, there will be ongoing conversations now, but the big pressure is taken out of these conversations because the deal has been done on cars and pharma. And those were the big ticket items. The deal today has saved tens of thousands of jobs in those sectors. So we can now move forward and have a much more measured, calm conversation with the US about how we look at other lines. It's not just going to be in agriculture. There's the whole food and drink sector, things like whiskey, things like gin, things like chocolate, that we want to get into the US market as well. But we do it under no pressure. And we've now established principles such as reciprocity, such as no weakening of our standards, that mean that our British producers are in a very, very good position as a result of this deal.
I just want to talk briefly about ethanol, which is used in fuel. E10, for instance, which you might see at the petrol pumps, is 10% biofuel. Some concern from arable farmers about the impact of on the viability of home-produced ethanol once you remove the tariff from American imports. That's a real concern, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll listen to their concerns, but just to put this in context, less than 1% of arable land in this country produces the grain that goes into bioethanol, and there are alternative products it can go into, like biodiesel, for instance, and other products. So I think it's something that we can live with. This was a negotiation. There was a conversation going on. We've done what we needed to do to protect the wider British economy, but also to get British agriculture, a very, very good deal. We've acted in the national interest here. There is no undercutting on standards. There's reciprocity. This is an opportunity for the best British producers to get into the US and sell their great British products and make money from doing it.
DEFRA Secretary Steve Reed. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Rebecca Rooney, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.